Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you're joining us from. This is the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy with the June session of Shaping the Future of Food. You're going to learn all about the Farm Bill and conservation funding today. There was some recent action by the Senate, so you're going to get the news right hot off the press. I'm Claudia Arand, and we're excited that you're here today for our June 2026 session. This month, we will hear from Michael Happ. Michael is the Program Associate for Climate and Rural Communities, and Michael will discuss the Farm Bill, conservation funding, and talk about his latest paper in the Closed Out series. Please. So who is IATP? IATP is the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and we're a nonprofit research and policy organization dedicated to the realization of just and resilient food systems. We work at the intersection of food systems, climate change, and international trade. About 2 years ago, we launched a monthly virtual program called Shaping the Future of Food, where we provide an overview of IATP, who we are, and what we do. And today will be the last Shaping the Future of Food session in our spring series, and we're glad you could join. IATP strives to provide data-informed perspectives that are accessible to the general public, and your support of our nonprofit organization makes this work possible. If you're enjoying today's episode and find it informative, please consider supporting IATP's work with a donation. But now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Michael Happ. Michael is the Program Associate for Climate and Rural Communities at IATP. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Claudia, and it's really great to see so many folks on the webinar today. So again, I'm Michael Happ. I've been with IATP for about 5 years now, and a lot of my focus here at IATP is on federal farm and food policy, with a focus on climate and conservation. Been doing a lot of work over the past 5 years, looking at Farm Bill conservation programs, advocacy around the Farm Bill. Programs like EQIP and CSP, which I'll get into a little bit later. But kind of my vision for the webinar today, kind of talk about farm policy as it stands right now, kind of do a 101 of like what does federal farm policy even do? Talk about some recent news, and then talk about a report we put out recently on conservation usage. So again, gonna try and keep it 101. We can get into the weeds later at the Q&A if you want, but I know there's a kind of a wide spectrum of folks on the call who, this might be the first time learning about the Farm Bill, and others who could tell you exactly what section the Conservation Reserve Program is. So yeah, try to put a little bit of everything in there for you. But anyway, so again, my name is Michael Happ, and yeah, just gonna get started. So in my work, there's I think a lot about there's an old Stan Rogers song called "The Field Behind the Plow." Stan Rogers is a Canadian folk singer. Some of you might be familiar with. If you ever got into the sea shanty phase around 2020, you might be familiar with some of his songs. But a lot of kind of folk songs about life in Canada and people on the prairies and in the Maritimes. But his song "Field Behind the Plow," I think about it a lot in the work I do. It reminds me of my family and a lot of the farm families out there that are over leveraged, hanging on as best they can, but still finding pride in the work they do as farmers. And one of the lines is pretty direct, but I think it's still potent. And it says, if the harvest's any good, the money might just cover all the loans. You've mortgaged all you own. So there's this level of financial precarity that's way too common on farms and has been common for decades at this point. And it makes me think of a lot of farm families like my own. You kind of walk into their living room or somewhere in their basement, and you might find an aerial image of the farm. And this image on the slide right here is one for my farm that I grew up on and my family still lives on today. And I think sometime in the 40s or 50s, there must have been some business where people in planes offered to take a picture of your farm from the sky, sell it to you, and sometimes it's even colorized. I laugh at this picture because, it's clearly the height of summer. Corn is green, soybeans across the road are green, but the person who colorized this black and white image decided to paint the trees as if it's fall. So a little bit of confusion there, but it's still pretty. And there's even a tree that they just kind of invented out in the field. Um, but you see a lot of pictures like this framed in folks' homes. Um, and depending on how old it is, you might see a lot of farms that have kind of any combination of orchards and chicken coops, pastures for livestock, grain fields, and a big garden for home use. Right? This is kind of the romantic ideal of a farm that we think of today. And it's also kind of the ideal that a lot of new and beginning farmers have. They want to try and replicate that or start some kind of modern version of that if they get access to land. Um, and if you look, you compare those old aerial images to images today, you see some of those outbuildings torn down. You might see pastures converted to row crop fields. Um, that's not always the case, but we know from the data that for a lot of farms this is true. In my own farm, my own family farm. This is kind of a midway point, right? Between when we had those orchards and those pastures to being more row crop oriented. But even today, it's kind of going in a new and different direction of bringing livestock back onto the land, growing fresh cut flowers, for example. But some of these outbuildings are torn down now, and there's a big shed, big enough to fit some of the big equipment that you need for modern conventional agriculture. And again, I want to underscore, I don't think that all change is bad, right? Highly diversified farms are a lot of work, and not everyone wants that. And you see some growth in small, highly diversified farms. Here in Minnesota, that's actually one of the growth areas you saw between the ag census of 2017 and 2022. You saw more farms in the 10 to 50 acre range get on the land. And a lot of those folks are doing direct marketing. They're diversified farms. They're new and beginning farmers. And I think there's some hope there. But, across the country for decades now, there's been this trend of there being fewer and fewer farms on the land and the farms that do exist getting bigger and bigger. Um, and I just want to underscore that that's a direct result of federal farm policy, right? There are folks who want more choice in what they can grow and how, and to be able to make a reasonable living off of it, but federal farm policy stands in the way of that. And again, if you're not a farmer and you're on this webinar, you probably buy food. Um, and what you can buy, what you can eat, and what you can put in your body U.S. federal farm policy affects that too. So, kind of the overarching question that I ask myself, is look when looking at policy, is it designed for the farmer? Is it designed for the consumer, or is it designed more for the companies that sell the things to the farmer and the consumer? Um, Next slide, please. So that brings us to the topic of the Farm Bill, right? Like the food and farm system as we know it, it's sprawling. It affects all of us. It affects what ends up on our plates and how much we pay for it. And it also affects how many farms are on the land and what kinds of farms they are, as well as kind of the crops grown on those farms and where they go after harvest. And because of the comprehensive nature of the food and farm system, we ended up with this really comprehensive bill that covers all that, what's known as the Farm Bill. So this slide tried to kind of show the images, the different parts of the Farm Bill. There are 12 different titles or sections, if you want to call them, of the Farm Bill. Um, we've got a title on commodities, right? Payments to folks who grow commodity crops. We've got conservation, right? That's how we pay for things like cover crops and things like that. We've got trade, we've got energy, nutrition, credit, rural development, research, horticulture, crop insurance, forestry, and the mysterious miscellaneous title. Um, So the Farm Bill has kind of been this mainstay in federal policy since at least the 1930s. That was the decade of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, right? That decade saw some pretty seismic shifts in who lived on farms, what they grew, and how financially secure they were. You also saw the Great Depression greatly expand the number of people going hungry. And that was, people in urban areas, people in rural areas, kind of a lot of migration from rural to urban, people looking for jobs. And so it was natural that at that time, a comprehensive farm bill would combine programs that support farmers and programs that support the hungry. Again, lots of folks were left out of that original farm bill. I don't want to hold it up as some ideal, just kind of underscoring how modern farm policy got that start. So you had these programs that supported folks who were waiting in bread lines, um, as well as kind of the beginnings of a soil conservation service, right? How do you make sure that we don't have another dust bowl, that we keep the soil in place, that we're farming in a smart way? Next slide, please. So just kind of want to show of these 12 titles, not all of them are equal, right? The percentages you see on each of these pictures is kind of what percent of the Farm Bill budget goes to each title. And for a lot of these, we're talking less than 1%, well less than 1%. And you'll see one program in particular, the nutrition title, which pays for things like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the program previously known as food stamps. Vast majority of the Farm Bill budget goes to nutrition assistance. Um, Next slide, please. Another way of looking at this is this really great artwork from Civil Eats, kind of this pie chart that shows what percentage of each, uh, what percentage of total Farm Bill funding goes to each title. And this, you'll notice the numbers are a little bit different between the previous slide and this one. Some numbers have changed over time. This art is from a few years ago, but it's still kind of the general, the point. It's like, and you can understand um, how in farm policy right now, if you're looking at the farm bill as just numbers on a page or kind of a budget to save money in, the nutrition title is a constant target of cuts. And we even saw in recent years major cuts to the nutrition title and kind of reallocating some of those resources to other titles of the farm bill, going from nutrition to things like commodities and crop insurance, for example. So So right now we're still operating on the 2018 Farm Bill. That policy was good for 5 years and was set to expire in 2023. Um, Again, the Farm Bill, it's supposed to happen every 5 years, uh, kind of trying to keep up to date with where the farm economy is right now, adapt to where, the unique struggles farmers are facing every couple of years. Um, and 2018 was more than 5 years ago. Congress still hasn't passed a farm bill to update our policy. Instead, they've put in three different one-year extensions. They even broke apart the farm bill, passing some of the provisions in the Republican budget bill that passed last year, with the rest being debated in Congress right now. And we'll get to that soon. And again, things are different in the farm economy than they were in 2018. That was before COVID, before some of the inflation we've seen, some of the recent tariffs. And as we mentioned earlier, we're in the midst of a pretty major drought across a lot of the country right now. So that's one of the critiques we have of the Farm Bill as it exists today. It just doesn't match the scale of the problems facing farmers, and it certainly doesn't serve all farmers equally, right? Crop insurance as it exists right now only covers about a quarter of farmers. Commodity payments, you know, they don't go to farmers of so-called specialty crops, a lot of the food that we actually eat. IATP has been advocating for a long time to have more equity there as far as making sure specialty crops and highly diversified farmers get their fair shake. We've also been advocating for a long time for a separate competition title of the Farm Bill, right? There's a lot of highly concentrated, highly anti-competitive parts of the ag industry right now. You see the beef sector, about four companies controlling over 85% of that market. Seed is highly concentrated. Poultry, my family used to raise pigs, and then right around the year 2000, you saw that market crash, and most independent hog producers went out of business, and we see more and more of that sector being covered by really large companies and kind of that vertical integration throughout the hog industry. Um, Next slide, please. So again, as Claudia mentioned, there's Farm Bill's been in the news a lot. Congress seems to actually finally be acting on updating this Farm Bill that hasn't really been updated since 2018, with the exception of the budget bill last year. Um, so this is kind of a smattering of headlines from recent weeks and months. Um, the House of Representatives, they passed a Farm Bill last month. Uh, the Senate released draft text of a Farm Bill within the last few days. And a lot of the coverage has been on some really hot button issues and some of the partisan maneuvering around it. Again, farm bills have historically been pretty bipartisan, um, even though they've been kind of status quo as well. Um, so one of the debates right now is around food aid, right? There's some pretty, wonky changes to the nutrition title of the Farm Bill that shifts a lot of the cost from the federal government to state governments, and also leaves a lot of people out of the nutrition programs. So you see Democrats kind of fighting for this nutrition program. Hey, let's stave off some of these changes for a couple of years, and then we can negotiate on the rest. The most recent bill that came out of the Senate did not include any kind of um, delay in those changes. Um, a lot of news centered around some pretty hot button issues in the House Farm Bill, including pesticide preemption, right? Like, do people have the right to sue a pesticide manufacturer if they get cancer from those products? There's a lot of news around animal welfare. Uh, States like California and Massachusetts have laws on the books where if you're going to sell things like pork or veal or eggs into their market, uh, the animals raised for those products have to meet certain animal welfare standards, like how much room they have to roam inside their confinements or things like that. There are proposals out there to kind of override that, to say that no, you, California, can't dictate how people raise their animals. But of course, you see about a quarter of hog producers, for example, already um, being compliant with Prop 12, this California proposition that are around animal welfare. Um, and you see a lot of independent producers already making these changes to get into that market and have that premium, whereas you see those larger companies that are really reliant on a confinement system who are speaking out against it. Um, so yeah, happy to get into more of that in the Q&A if people have specific questions, but from the looks of it, um, it's a more partisan process than a lot of people were hoping for, right? The House bill was not really negotiated on a bipartisan basis, even though there were some Democrats who voted with a lot of the Republicans. Um, and again, some of the more controversial things from the House Farm Bill are not included in the Senate-based text. And we're still kind of looking at, okay, will some of those show up in amendments? Are they gonna, come up later in other ways? Another thing is ethanol, right? There's a push to um, have 15% ethanol in gasoline blends year round, whereas right now there's in the summertime that's not the case. Kind of air quality issues, waiver has to come from the EPA. It's all very wonky stuff, but a lot of people are kind of looking at that. Next slide. So I'm going to drill down a little bit into one title that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and that's Title II, the conservation title. This slide shows some of the kinds of conservation that Farm Bill policy can help farmers pay for. conservation in the U.S. is a spectrum for sure. We can go from practices as simple as planting cover crops when there's not a crop out in the field. Um, it's kind of, if you're a commodity crop farmer, you want to keep the soil in place. Cover crops are kind of a good gateway practice, right? You can grow things. You can even use it for forage for livestock, or if nothing else, just keeping the soil in place and keeping continuous living cover while your crop's not out there. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have some farmers that are kind of pursuing almost like a food forest model, right? Where you have trees with fruits and nuts and integrating livestock into that and pasture and all these, kind of nature and food production intermingled and difficult to tell apart. And there's a whole lot in between that. And this slide is kind of an encapsulation of some of those things, right? So we've got cover crops, we've got fencing for livestock and managed rotational grazing. We've got alley cropping and windbreaks. We've got a growing movement for silvopasture, where you've got those livestock grazing in a forest and maybe even foraging off of fruit and nut-bearing trees. Kind of the lower left here, you have grassed waterways, right? Those are the sorts of practices that manage for erosion. You can imagine in this picture there was maybe there was a channel where a lot of soil was being lost. That's where the water went. What if we planted grasses and trees to keep that soil in place? And then lower right, you see hoop houses, or otherwise known as high tunnels. That's something that conservation programs can help pay for too, and they're really popular with small scale farmers. Um, so at IATP for the past 5 years or so, um, we've been looking at two federal conservation programs in particular and their adoption across the country. We've got the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, also known as EQIP, and the Conservation Stewardship Program, known as CSP. EQIP is kind of meant for those farmers who they might have one or two conservation needs on their farm. Think of that gully erosion or a creek that has some water quality concerns. A farmer can go to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and say, I'd like to implement this waterway or put in this buffer, figure out some nutrient management strategies, and I'd like to, have some financial assistance to help pay for that. Or I need help, actually figuring out what the best fit for my farm is. So they go into their local office and they talk with someone about that and apply and hopefully get in and can implement those practices. And then CSP is kind of that next step, right? If you liked your equip practice, it did some good conservation on your farm, and you're thinking the next step, like how can I implement this all across my farm? I want better soil health across the whole operation. I want to improve wildlife habitat across my whole farm. That's kind of what CSP is for. It's kind of putting together those whole farm plans and bundling different practices together and thinking more in a systems way rather than a one-off practice. Um, Next slide. So over the years, these programs have proven popular, right? There are always scores more farmers that apply to these programs than get in. And there was some data that got out there about the issue of, farmers applying and not getting into the programs, but hearing a lot of anecdotes, and it was, kind of hard to access some of that data. So, um, and some of it was around, okay, acres conserved, a number of contracts, but um, we kind of saw this gap and talked to a lot of farmers and farm groups about, trying to find the data on, okay, how many farmers do apply for these programs and how many get in? Because we had been hearing a lot of stories of folks getting closed out of the programs, especially small scale producers. So we went out and looked for the data. We did some data requests to USDA. And now for about 5 years or so, we've been putting out what we're calling our closed out series. Just kind of looking at, okay, for EQIP and CSP, how many farmers apply to these programs every year and how many get in, and displaying that as a percentage, displaying the actual numbers as well, trying to show the data in a lot of different ways. Um, so we last month we published our latest installment of our closed out series. It's a report we call One Step Forward, Two Steps Back for Conservation. In this report, we not only present the data on how many farmers apply to and get into EQIP and CSP, but we also put the numbers in context of recent policy changes at the federal level. Since we've been looking at this since 2021, we've seen the programs be underfunded. We saw a big investment in the programs from the Biden administration. And then as administration has changed, we saw a freezing of those funds. And we've also seen a lot of staffing cuts at USDA recently that hamper farmer outreach for these programs, as well as the effects of a budget bill from the Republican Congress that rescinded and theoretically reinvested conservation funds for the long haul. However, one of our issues with the recent Farm Bill proposals by the House and Senate is that they actually cut funding to these oversubscribed and underfunded conservation programs to fund other parts of of the Farm Bill. And again, we think this is misguided, right? If you see, we kind of have a snapshot from the report in the upper right-hand corner, kind of nationwide over the past 5 or 6 years, what's happened with equip application trends. And um, you can kind of see back around 2020, um, hovering around between a quarter and a third of applicants getting into that program. And then you see the effects of investments from the Biden administration. And then within the last year or so, that number trailing off and kind of getting back to the acceptance rates from previously. So on this slide, I've got a QR code. You can access the new report. And we're also just going to walk through it a little bit briefly. So Lily has the link, and so if you could just scroll down to the first infographic, one of the big differences this year is that um, we're making it interactive, right? You can hover over the new graphs and you can see from year to year, how things change in the US, but also state to state. So you can see we've got California here. If you're interested, we've got some territories as well. But in Iowa, for example, you saw maybe about, a little over 20% of farmers getting into programs like EQIP, really going up from IRA investments, Inflation Reduction Act, and then tanking again. And we kind of point to the influence of staffing cuts as well as the rescission of funds in recent years. Um, and then if you want to scroll down, Lily, we also have some tables that you can see the number of applications by state. We've ranked them by the highest percentages of folks who apply getting in. And then if you want to scroll down even farther, we've got some cool maps that show you the difference between um, fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025, kind of showing you not only, the number of applications awarded in each year, as well as the change from year to year. So again, I hope you enjoy looking at the data, playing around with it. Um, I'm always open for any questions. You can email me at mhap@iatp.org, or we can answer some of them right now. Yeah, I think that's all I have to share. Yeah, there was a lot. Tried to keep it high level, but I think I have a problem with that sometimes, getting too into the weeds. But yeah,
Well, thank you, Michael, for giving us this really great overview and information. And as I mentioned in the chat, we will follow up with everybody by sending the slides and also the links and everything to Michael's presentation. So if you didn't catch everything right now, we will certainly send that to you. We did get a couple of questions in the chat. So Michael Jean's asking, people in my community who care about forests worry about the damage that cattle do to the banks of rivers and streams when cattle are allowed in forests. Any thoughts on this?
yeah. So definitely want to underscore that, all of these practices should be done in coordination with conservation staff, the folks who know about the kind of effects to the ecosystem that livestock might have, right? If you're getting a practice to put in fencing or do some of this managed rotational grazing or silvopasture, right? you got to do it the right way, right? And I think there are a lot of folks who are looking at, okay, can we replicate natural systems with livestock? Here in Minnesota, there are lots of folks looking at, okay, with grasslands, can we use cattle in the same way that bison used to graze, right? Are we, how often do we have to rotate them in order to make sure there's not damage to the ecosystem? And I think um, putting fencing in the right place, making sure that the cattle aren't on the riverbanks for too long and causing too much erosion. Like that's all things that highly trained technical staff should be there to help out with. Um, yeah, in no way advocating for things that would damage the ecosystem for sure. Um,
Okay, thanks, Michael. So we also have a question from Sharon, who's asking, curious if these smaller 10 to 50 acre new farmers have to lease land versus owning the farms and the pros and cons of the systems that would enable and attract more regional and small farmers.
yeah, I don't have the stats on that. That might exist in the ag census, but I do know that land access is a huge issue for new and beginning farmers, right? And we kind of have this disconnect of, you know, folks who have access to land or own land already who might be thinking about, okay, who do I leave this to? Kind of succession planning, and they might have kids who aren't interested in taking over the farm. So those folks might just choose to sell their land at auction and have an outside investor or consortium buy up the land for the highest price. Um, but there's also a growing movement of, hey, I want someone who doesn't have access to land, I want them to access this and get their start. Um, we see some folks getting their starts on incubator farms, right? Like if you if you didn't grow up farming and you want to get your start, like starting with an eighth of an acre if you're a small scale farmer, and then growing up from there and getting, your feet under you. I think that's something that folks have been looking at and um, has shown itself to work a little bit here in Minnesota. Um, and then there are also some programs through the federal government. There's the Conservation Reserve Program. It has a transition incentives program where, there are these farmers who have conservation contracts that are expiring and they're figuring out what to do next. And, um, kind of incentivizing those farmers to offer their land to new and beginning farmers, those folks who want to get in. But I don't have the numbers off the top of my head for how many rent versus own, but I do know that it is, it's a big issue, and there are some bills in Congress and lots of movement to try and would recommend looking at some of the stuff from the National Young Farmers Coalition. They are really great leaders on this issue and totally worth checking them out.
Good, thanks for that, Michael. Another question from Jean is, in my community, EQIP is used a lot to help confined animal feeding operations build manure lagoons and such things. In the opinion of many, CAFOs are harmful to the environment and conservation monies should be spent on other measures. Other thoughts?
Yeah, totally agree. We
Okay,
have some
thanks,
other
Mike.
we have some other reports that we've put out, one called Payments for Pollution, where we look into this issue specifically of, how much of our equip dollars are going to CAFOs. And, kind of a conservative estimate is 30% of equip dollars going to some of these industrial practices, but in some states that's probably a lot more. And we've long advocated that, we think that conservation dollars should go toward true conservation. Um, and meanwhile, we do see it especially in states like North Carolina and even here in Minnesota, where um, a lot of the contracts go to CAFOs for practices like manure lagoons, which, on a comparing cost to cost basis, a manure lagoon might cost upwards of $100,000 of taxpayer dollars, whereas a cover crop contract might be about $9,000. And meanwhile, it's a lot of the small folks who want to do some of the more real conservation that are getting closed out. And on top of that, we've seen this exodus of USDA staff, um, and there's a lot more pressure on them. And it's honestly easier for for them to send out larger contracts to fewer farmers, rather than send out a lot of smaller contracts to more farmers. So I think this issue of public conservation dollars going to things that aren't conservation and the staffing issue are really connected, and we've written a bit about that too. So yeah, totally agree and think that's a big issue.
Yep, and as we mentioned, and as you probably saw pop up in the chat, there are some links to our papers, and we will again send that out with a follow-up email if you don't catch that all during the session right now. So no worries, we will send all that information in the follow-up. Isabel's asking, just in general, what is the ratio and how many apply to equip and get in? And I know it changes by state and stuff, but
Mhm.
is there just an overall ratio?
Yeah, so for fiscal year 25, the latest year we have data for, only about 24% of those who applied to equip got in nationwide. And I should have mentioned that actually earlier. So kind of flip that the other way, that's 76% of folks applying who don't get in. And again, we have all these numbers in the report if you want to look at it on a state by state basis too. But you know, you kind of see this trend of staying level, um, going up and then going back down, nationwide as well as by state. Um, and I think the the stats are even worse in a lot of like ag heavy states. Like I'm thinking of Illinois. It's frequently less than 20% of applicants who get in. Whereas I'm thinking of states like Rhode Island and Alaska, they're usually pretty good at connecting most of their applicants to contracts. They're smaller ag states, kind of a history of well-funded and well-resourced conservation districts and really good relationship building there.
Thanks, Michael. Selden mentions these issues with conservation tie in with our programs on agroecology, which, yes, true. This is so important. What organizations are pushing these policies in Congress, and how can we make these voices louder? Even Democratic senators don't seem that interested in these issues. And I know
Yeah,
you work with a bunch of coalitions and a bunch of organizations that are involved in all of this.
yeah, that's something we're pushing for, right? Like, as I mentioned, the Farm Bill is huge, and there are a lot of different priorities people have in the Farm Bill. And, rightly so, like a lot of people are focusing on the nutrition part right now because it's such a big part of the Farm Bill. And that's kind of, for Democrats, their red line in negotiations right now. And one of the things that we're advocating for is like that's a good red line to have, but it shouldn't be the only one, right? You should also be, um, advocating for more conservation, more agroecological systems. And there are lots of folks, we're in the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And, there are, I think, over 130 groups as a part of that coalition. And a lot of those groups are farmer groups, folks who are trying to implement more agroecology on the ground. Um, and they're kind of pushing for this as well. And again, almost every state in the country has farmer groups pushing for this. So um, there are people out there. We're trying to get the message out and trying to advocate for a farm bill that meets farmers where they are and the challenges facing them. But I agree, it's uh, Congress is a roadblock, and there's a lot of other interests there.
Well, we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. As Michael mentioned, if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to us or respond to the follow-up email that we send, and we'll be more than happy to follow up and chat with you separately. So Jacques is asking, do you see many conventional farms moving toward being more diversified and ecology oriented? So do we see a shift?
Yeah, I don't have good stats for you on this, but I think um, we did see um, between the last two ag censuses a huge um, increase in the number of folks planting cover crops. Again, I think of cover crops as kind of this gateway conservation practice. It's, keeping the soil in place. It's, pretty far away from what you might consider agroecology, but it is a good first step. And we've seen in Minnesota, for example, um, back during the 2019 season, you saw really heavy rains, and the folks who had planted cover crops, they were able to get in and get crops in the ground, whereas folks who didn't, their fields were left fallow, and they had to do a prevented planting claim through the crop insurance program. So we're trying to make this connection between funding conservation on one hand and savings from things like crop insurance on the other, right? Conservation can help save taxpayer dollars. And then, we're hoping that the folks who see success from cover crops then implement more and more conservation and go more in that direction. But again, it's a spectrum. I don't have good stats for you on that. I think last time I checked, maybe about 4% of US farmland was in EQIP and CSP, and about, I don't want to give you a bad number on how much is in cover crops, but I believe it's in the single digits still.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. And to actually make a pitch for one of our latest podcasts on agroecology, we do know that there's some information in there about some traditional or conventional farmers using some kind of agroecological techniques as they, and seeing success in that. So we'll also send a link for that about our most recent podcast series. So thank you so much, Michael, for sharing all your information. And I know you don't take a lot of credit for it, but it's really all you who pulls all this information together and puts these fantastic reports together. So thank you for that. So this was the last Shaping the Future of Food session for this spring, and we're glad you could join us for today's episode. As I mentioned, you'll receive a follow-up email that will be jam-packed with information. ITP strives to provide data-informed perspectives that are accessible to the general public, and your financial support of our nonprofit organization makes this work possible. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider making a donation to IATP. And then again, thank you for joining us today, and stay tuned for information about our fall session, and we will send that out sometime during the summer. Thank you and goodbye.